No one is talking about this. As we know, the Pittsburgh Penguins are going to continue to make moves throughout the summer. There's one player in particular and one situation they have to figure out before the season starts, as it has major implications on not only the success of the team this coming season, but in following seasons after that. We're going to break down exactly what that is and why no one's talking about it and why everybody should be talking about it as we creep closer to the season. But before we do that, a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. About 68% of you who watch these videos are not subscribed to the channel. So if you want to stay up to date with everything that's happening with the Pittsburgh Penguins, go down below, hit that free subscribe button, because this is the place to be for all your daily Pittsburgh Penguins content. But Nick, let's dive right into it. The player we're going to be talking about today and the situation has to do with Kris Letang. Nobody's really talking about Kris Letang. He's still here. Hello. He's still playing right D for this team. And I think it's pretty interesting. And Kelsey had an article about it because it's pretty interesting what his role is going to be next season, because there's a lot of chatter about Rickard Rakell and Brian Rust that doesn't really necessarily concern Kris Letang. But you know what does? Erik Karlsson. He could be moved out pretty soon. Sounds like there's some smoke there, that's for sure. They view him as an asset, but it looks like they do want to move off of him. But what's the role for Kris Letang moving forward? We know that Karlsson, is becoming underrated around the league per se. If you put him on a contender with the numbers he's still putting up at his age and injury history, he could probably put up like 60 to 70 points playing power play one for another team, a contending team. So that's been pretty interesting. I want your thoughts on that, of course, as well. But what's your take on Kris Letang? There's a lot of moving parts with the Pittsburgh Penguins this year. They have 4 right shot defensemen. Let's not forget that we just covered last week. Matt Dumba is now a Pittsburgh Penguin as well. They traded for Connor Clifton. I say they. Kyle Dubas made all these moves for Connor Clifton, of course. And then you have Erik Karlsson and Kris Letang. So what's your take on that? Because things are starting to get, a little crazier. There's a bit of a logjam. And for guys making $6.1 million, let's say, or more than $5 million, you needed more of a defined role, I think. And Kris Letang, it seems like he might not have that heading into the new year.
To be honest, Darius, I wouldn't be too worried about the Connor Clifton and Matt Dumba side of things. I think those guys are going to be in and out of the lineup. Matt Dumba has become a healthy scratch in the past few teams he's been on. So from my point of view, Matt Dumba is just an extra 7th defenseman. And even looking at the graphic you have up right now, that is what Puckpedia has him as. And I feel like the Penguins coaching staff also might view him in the same manner. Just the extra body who's played a lot of NHL games, who can come in and out of the lineup. Same thing, similar with Connor Clifton. Where Kris Letang is interesting because you mentioned it at the beginning of the video. Nobody is talking about Kris Letang.
Yep.
Everyone's talking about Erik Karlsson. People are even talking about Sidney Crosby, Evgeni Malkin, Rickard Rakell, Brian Rust. For Kris Letang's it's interesting because I feel like he's the least tradable player they have because his production. We know prime Kris Letang was a very, very good player, an upper echelon tier, top tier defenseman, of course. But now his production has kind of dropped off. He's playing less minutes. I think the injuries are finally catching up to him. He's been a resilient player throughout his career. He's dealt with some crazy injuries that he's always been able to bounce back from. But again, 30 points in 74 games, I think one of the lowest marks of his career in a long time. It just seems like, it may be time for Kris Letang to go off into the sunset just a little bit. I don't think he'll be traded from the Penguins. I think, he honestly makes a lot of sense for him to just finish his career there. And what his role will be, I think it depends on what happens with Karlsson. If Karlsson is, on the squad going into next season, I think Kris Letang will play a little bit less minutes. Karlsson will take more of the offensive brunt, which he kind of did last year. And if Erik Karlsson is traded, I mean, Kris Letang's still gonna have to bear a lot of the load for the Pittsburgh Penguins defense because just looking at it, there's no one else. So I don't see Kris Letang ever leaving the team. A lot of his role does depend on Erik Karlsson, of course, whether he stays or he goes. And maybe that'll happen closer to the trade deadline, or maybe it'll happen tomorrow. We don't know. But I think that's what the situation would look like based on what happens with Erik Karlsson does impact what happens with Kris Letang a lot from an on-ice perspective.
Definitely. And I think there's a lot of chatter, and we've covered it on the channel, about Sidney Crosby potentially leaving. Maybe not this year, but maybe, 2 seasons from now or next season, right? Coming up after the 2025-26 season. But the one thing for me with, players not leaving, Kris Letang is not leaving. He's going to be a Pittsburgh Penguin. But heading into next year, they do have to find a defined role for him, I think. Especially, and it's very interesting if they do keep Erik Karlsson, because he is probably going to play power play 1 minutes. Erik Karlsson, this is. And they're probably going to continue to try and shop him heading into, the trade deadline and next season, all of these things. I do want to pop up Kris Letang's stats again, because it's pretty interesting. 74 games, and he stayed relatively healthy as well. And it's not a slight to him or anything like that. I mean, this is a guy who's dealt with 2 strokes in his NHL career, and he's come back and, still been a very good player, like a upper echelon player, like you put it earlier in the video. 30 points last season. It's not horrible. Everyone was a minus player if you're looking at that on your screen right now on the Penguins last year, so I don't put too much stock into that. But he was playing a ton of minutes. He was averaging almost 24 minutes a night. So it gets pretty interesting. Of course, with Karlsson, he was averaging almost the same, but he put up 53 points last year. This is your guy that you want to quarterback the power play if he's staying with the Penguins. So it's interesting. I wonder if, Letang takes over that spot again next season if they do trade Karlsson. But if they do hang on to him, I just wonder what Letang's role is at this point. You're not going to be able to trade him, like you mentioned, right? Like, do you see them even looking at a Letang trade? I don't think any team is probably interested in him. Not a slight on him at all, again. But do you see any team wanting to trade for this player? Can they offload this contract? I feel like he's just going to be a Penguin until he's 41, but they have to find more of a defined role. Or what exactly is his role heading into next year?
Well, I don't think it really makes a lot of sense to trade a Kris Letang. I also don't think people are going to be lining up for Kris Letang. I think the other assets we mentioned, like the Crosbys, Malkins, Rakels, Russ,
Right.
Karlssons, there's more of a market out for players like that. As you have on the screen, like, obviously he's doing his off-season training. He's trying to lock back in for the next season. And I think his role, again, like I've been hammering home throughout the video, is what happens with Erik Karlsson, will kind of shape Kris Letang's role. Because if Erik Karlsson's not there, Kris Letang is still that number 1 defenseman for them.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to be on power play 1, play 23 minutes, take a lot of hard matchups. So, maybe unfortunate for him in his age, but the Penguins really have no one else to do that. And I think maybe it could be a more, less intensive approach for Letang, just because the team is going to be the team isn't going to be very good. They're going to be at the bottom of the standings. And, he can just maybe have a good time with the guys he's played with, like his whole career with the Crosbys and the Malkins. And I think at the end of the day, you kind of rely on Kris Letang for his skill and what he can do offensively. Although he's always been a solid defensive player, of course, in his career. I think we look at him as, the top power play first pair guy. He's probably not that anymore, all things considered, with respect to him and everything he's been throughout his career. But I think his role is going to still end up being that top right defenseman, because Erik Karlsson seems like he's going to get traded. And I think a team will covet Erik Karlsson's services way more than they would have Kris Letang. Maybe I could see a situation where a team was like, okay, like I don't, kind of comparing it to the Carolina situation with Brent Burns.
Mm-hmm.
They traded for a guy. Also, technically, Erik Karlsson was also on the team at that point too. So they traded Brent Burns away. Carolina put him in a lesser role, and he actually did succeed, and he's been able to prolong his career. Maybe something similar could happen with the Kris Letang, where he goes to a team, he can put on the third pair, get more power play minutes, just be safe for that kind of utility type player. And I could see that happening, but in all likelihood, the contract is a lot, and I think Kris Letang is a special case where it kind of just makes sense for him to just finish out his career in Pittsburgh. I think the return will be something nobody is happy about, considering how good he is, and how much he gave to the team. So, in my opinion, Darius, I think he's just going to be, that super good, plays all roles, right defenseman again, because I think Karlsson's going to be gone soon. And I think he does finish out his career in Pittsburgh. I don't see him going anywhere, and I don't see a trade just being worth it for the Pittsburgh Penguins.
I agree with you, and I think that he's ultimately going to finish his career as a Pittsburgh Penguin. I just think it's very interesting that, throughout the summer, since the season ended, I haven't heard his name uttered at all. Like, nobody's really talking about him or what his role is heading into next season. But I think it's going to be status quo, as at least right now, because Erik Karlsson's still on the team. But if Erik Karlsson is moved, then he's going to be relied upon to do a little bit more. And all things equal, if you look at the history, their ages, obviously injury history as well, Erik Karlsson's not as good defensively as, Kris Letang. So a lot of teams would like Erik Karlsson just for his offensive ability, of course, but Letang's still going to be relied upon, I think, in terms of more of the defensive matchups and stuff like that, and being a number 1 defenseman still. And ultimately, I do think he'll finish his career as a Pittsburgh Penguin, but it's going to be interesting to see what they end up doing. And hey, listen, like, they might be re-energized if they do trade an Erik Karlsson, let's say, and it's like, hey, one last time for one last season, you three, Malkin, Crosby, Letang, you guys are playing power play 1, like, make some magic happen, see what you can do. And maybe they'd be a little bit more re-energized, because it's like, hey, this is the last dance for us. So that could be interesting. And well, I guess we'll see what happens. But any final thoughts on that, Nick? Because it's an interesting situation. Like, I think a lot of what his role will be next year really hinges on like what moves they're gonna make in August, let's say.
No, and I think like maybe I'll throw this to the comment section a little bit. Like, what are you guys thinking is gonna happen with Kris Letang throughout his contract? Do you think he's gonna finish as a Penguin? Are you holding on to him like some of you guys in the comments are holding on to a Sidney Crosby? If I see those comments, I understand why you guys are so attached to a guy like Sidney Crosby. But for me, I think Kris Letang is gonna finish his career with the Penguins. It doesn't make sense at all to trade him just because he's not amazing as he used to be. Whereas I can make the case for the other players that they're still very good and could really contribute to a playoff team. But Kris Letang, I think he's going to stay with the Penguins, hopefully usher in a new era of Penguins defensemen eventually. And I think that's where it's going to end up for Dubas and co over there in the Penguins front office.
As we know, there is a new era coming. Yeah, at some point. We just don't know exactly when or when they'll be NHL ready, but it's true, right? You do still want a couple guys who are maybe, you know, day one Penguins to stick around and be able to help out with some of the culture, of course, and, you know, some of the younger guys coming up through the system, because that's going to happen in the next 3 years once their contracts are up anyway. So it's going to be interesting to see what they end up doing. I am just curious as to what his role looks like and what Kris Letang's game will look like next season. Let us know how you feel in the comments, and if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with everything Pittsburgh Penguins.